Hello guys, and welcome to this brand new course in which we're going to examine the games of the Paul Morphy, and the entire course is dedicated to his games, and of course I'm going to tell you a little bit about his life as well. I suppose most of the people who work on chess and who are experienced chess players, or maybe even young players, might have heard about Paul Morphy, although of course he had lived long time ago. And I suppose the current young players, they focus more on the present players like Carlsen, Caruana, etc. Maybe they know something about the guys like Kasparov and Fischer. And that's how I have spoken with many young kids. When I ask them, do you know some players from the past? They know two or three, but they are not focusing in depth like in the times when I was young, for example, which was not that far away. Like it's not in the ancient time, but I remember when I was young, I was extremely interested in all the chess books which I could acquire, and I was reading about every player from the past, preferably, of course, the world champions. I had books on all of them until it was Karpov at the time and then Kasparov, but also I liked especially those kind of books which are semi-historical and chess, because they speak about the life of guys who lived in the 19th century. Of course, they show their games, but as well they say some funny stories, some facts about those players, about their career. And it was to me very interesting to think how the guys living in 18 something could even think to play chess. I suppose at that time there were much bigger problems than nowadays, of course, to survive, and not only to play chess but to be even very, very good players. And Paul Morphy was probably the best of his generation. Many people even today, guys like Kasparov, Carlsen, they call him like the father of the modern chess, because he has invented some kind of principles which maybe much later has become widespread from the guys like Wilhelm Steinitz, the first world champion, and later Lasker, Reti, and Tarash. So basically, what is the difference between the Paul Morphy and the players from his generation? He was born in the 1830s, and when I was checking, by the way, there is a very funny coincidence. I'm starting this course today, which is the 10th of July, and I randomly found out that actually Morphy has passed away exactly on this date today. So when I make this video, you can say that we celebrate a lot of years from from the time when he passed, and as they say, it's gone but not forgotten. Paul Morphy, when he was young, there are a lot of anecdotes and funny stories about how he learned to play the game. Some stories which might be not necessarily true, we never know. But in general, what we know for sure is that he was born in a very wealthy family. His father was a lawyer, his mother was kind of musician, and they were very, cultural family. They were living a very good life in New Orleans. And his father was playing chess. Of course, he was not that good with his relatives and his friends. And the story says that even his uncle says that actually no one have taught Paul how to play. He just learned himself by watching the games of his parents, a little bit like the stories about Capablanca. And then there are some other stories. Then some guests of his father, they wanted to play in the beginning with the father, but when Morphy started to play, the Paul Morphy when started to play, he was asked to play with some adults, and he was defeating them, including some game apparently made in 6 moves. So basically, he was good from a young age. But as you can imagine, at this time in the 1840s in America, no one is even thinking about chess seriously. Even in Europe, it was the time before the World Championship was started. Back then in Europe also, 1840s were the time where the people were gathering in the cafeterias. There were no tournaments like today. The first one was in 1851, which Adolf Andersen have won. So Morphy was playing somewhere in New Orleans or in New York. Few games he was defeating the local players, but he was not interested a lot from chess. And then we're going to focus in this first video exactly on his early games, and later we're going to speak about actually the time when he flourished and he was already becoming a very, very good player, and how he conquered the world. Okay, so in the beginning, the first games which we have written from Paul Morphy are from 1849, when he was like 10, and he had two opponents which most frequently he used to play. There are, they say that there are 50 games with each of them he played, and of course occasionally some other guys. One of those, I think two players was named James McConnell. We suppose, of course, that all those guys were some family friends who were maybe visiting his parents, and then they used to play a lot of chess. So the first game which I want to show you is between a guy called James McConnell. He was playing with white, and Paul Morphy was with black pieces. So let's see how the young 10 years old Paul Morphy is playing in the beginning of his chess journey. e4, not surprisingly, after e5, white goes f4, which we all know that it was the most popular opening at the time. The King's Gambit, very dangerous weapon for white, but also, as we know, very dangerous for white as well. So here usually there is no draw. Someone is winning, white or black. Draw is very rare result. Morphy takes this pawn, and after knight f3 already his next moves shows that he had some knowledge and some understanding about this position, because here he can play, as we know, any random move, which is okay. You can develop the knight, knight f6, knight c6, anything is good, but he goes g5, which is even by today's standards considered as one of the best moves. And now white has 3 or 4 moves. d4 is a good move, of course, to take control of the center. h4 is one of the main moves to force g4 and then to go knight e5 and knight g5. Bishop c4 and knight c3 are understandably also good developing moves, and indeed bishop c4 has been played. And the idea is that after g4, white will go knight e5, and then he is attacking both pawns. So you can give one check, but after probably king f1, then black has some problems how to defend all those pawns. So Morphy prefers to develop the bishop to g7. So he's taking the big diagonal and he's defending all those dark squares. Now there is no knight e5, so already black can start to think about g4 if there is such a possibility. Now white, I think, should have played probably d4. To me, of course, this looks like the most natural move. And I believe that then black has to play d6, which leads to some theoretical lines, but he played the move d3, which is not that good, because first of all, now white takes less space, and then the black bishop is controlling those dark squares. And for example, like I mentioned earlier, of course black can play knight c6 or d6, but even g4 makes sense, as white don't have any, you see, any useful move with his knight. knight d2 or knight g1 looks really very bad, and then simply black can give this check. So of course he can sacrifice the knight. This will be in the spirit of this age in general, but yeah, I don't think that this will be so good for white. But Morphy prefers to play h6, which is kind of more safe move, defending the pawn on g5, so it shows that he doesn't have the intention to push g4. He wants to have this kind of pawn chain, which is closing down the f file and it's closing down the dark square bishop. And after h6, when you defend the pawn, this will allow the knight to go to e7 or f6, because of course so far the queen was protecting, and if you put the knight on the way of the queen, then white would have taken the pawn. So yeah, it looks like a slow move, but it is very solid. White keeps developing, and now Morphy is moving the knight. He can go to e7 or he can go to f6. I think I will go maybe to e7 if I have to move really this knight, because after knight f6 you always have to consider moves like e5, and then the knight has to go here, but the queen is on this diagonal, so it is a bit more complicated. Of course, knight e7, then you can go to g6, which is a very kind of standard nowadays, of course, setup, because this knight is defending the pawn. He wants to go to e5, and again g4 is coming later as a threat. But okay, knight f6 is still a decent move. And now white, I believe that he didn't play it very well, which is of course totally normal. Those guys, okay, this guy is probably just a normal guy who plays chess at home, so he's not a chess player like now we go to play tournaments, so c3. The only idea which I see in this move, the pawn to c3, not the knight, is that maybe he wants to bring the queen to b3 and then to attack f7, which of course black can defend now very easy. And here, the next move, when I saw it, this was the move b5. Now, the guys who are familiar with the classical games and the most famous games in the history, I'm sure that many of them will immediately, when they see this move and this kind of sequence, King's Gambit b5 move, this will remind them of something which actually happened 2 years later in the game called the Immortal Game, but this is another story. Out of Andersen against Kiziritsky, there was such a moment when black played b5 early in the opening, like Morphy does in his age of 10. Of course, black won this game in a brilliant style, but he was the casualty. Of course, this is not a very good move. b5, you just give the pawn for nothing, and now white has already advantage. But c6, bishop c4, bishop a4 looks much better, because this will prevent black from his plan to go d5 and after pawn takes to capture with the pawn. But he preferred to go to c4, and then black can go d5, which again looks a little bit risky, because after pawn takes and pawn takes, the black king, we see that he is exposed, and he is exposed first by the file, which usually is the most dangerous for him, because now white can just give check with the rook or with the queen, and also he is exposed by the diagonal. So now white has a lot of possibilities. Even only if you want to give check, you can give check with the bishop, check with the queen, check with the queen from here, check with the rook, and of course you can simply retreat on b3. I believe bishop b5 should be the best move, and probably bishop d7, I suppose, and then after rook e1, black has to move the king, and then there is no castle. But white preferred to play queen e2, which is not that good. And this allows now the bishop to go to e6 and to close the e file. And again, Of course, the best move is this check, and then knight d7, and now knight e5 is possible, but it's not winning anything, as black can simply castle, and more or less I believe that black is totally fine. But after bishop b3, the bishop on b3 is not that active anymore, and after black castles, again, this is very unusual position with this pawn structure, obviously, but in general it looks okay for black. Maybe white can try sometimes to play g3 to sort the things with the f pawn, but this could allow, for example, ideas like g4 and then maybe f3, which you have to analyze. Of course, black can simply take. So now white is fighting for the center. He plays d4, which normally is a good move, and he should have done it as we discussed much earlier, because now he wants to bring the knight to e5. But Paul Morphy now sees a chance to activate his knight. And this is very interesting, especially again considering that this is one of the first games which we have of Morphy, and now in this game we see that not only he could have made a combination, which later we will discover, but even from positional point of view, he is playing actually quite decent moves. So after d4, now the square e4 is temporarily available. For example, if white starts with knight d2 first, and then d4, let's say we have this knight d2, knight c6, d4. Now this would have been not possible, right, immediately. But after d4, Morphy sees the chance to take this outpost, even if the theory about the outpost was not discovered yet. This is from Aaron Nimzowitsch when he wrote his book much later. But he sees that this is a very, very good square because the knight cannot be removed from a pawn. White is attacking the knight with the bishop. Probably better would be to move the knight first. But okay, bishop c2. And then you see the benefit to have a double pawns on the f file is that now both of them actually are quite important because they help black to control those central squares e3, e4, and also they're closing down the white bishops. White is developing and black is developing as well. So black has now, I would say, a very nice position, mainly of course because he has this very strong knight on e4. Here white has two extra pawns on the queen side, but he cannot use them to create a pass pawn or something, and black even, you can claim that he has an open file, so he can bring the rooks, the queen on the c file, on the b file, and black has two extra pawns here, which we know that sometimes the double pawns are weak, but when they are supported with the g pawn, they actually are very, very good, because g4 could be coming any moment, and then the queen can go to h4 or g5. The main problem for white is that the bishop on c1 cannot be activated very easy. So white now wants to get rid of this knight, and he goes c4, which, like an idea in general, is okay. He wants to trade this pawn and then to take the knight, but now black has a lot of hits on the d4 pawn. I suppose here probably g4 seems like a best move to me, because if you don't move the knight, I will just take it, and if you move it, knight e5 probably is losing a piece, and knight e1, I will be very happy if you go knight e1. But okay, Morphy takes, and he takes with the bishop, which again, nowadays of course every strong player would go g4 knight e4, but we cannot judge too much the young Paul Morphy. Bishop d4, he wants to give check, and his intention is that actually after white takes, which happened. He takes with the knight, so this is also good. Of course, black is still much better. He is winning a pawn, and the knight is making a fork, basically forcing white to go queen d3. And the next move is also very good, queen b6, and we have this queen on the diagonal towards the king, and we know that something bad is going to happen here for the white king. He sees the danger, so he's moving away from the diagonal. And now what the young Paul Morphy is doing, he takes the bishop, so maybe actually bishop d4, now when you look, it looks like a very good move, because more or less this was forced. Of course, he could have played king h1 without taking the bishop, but now white has to take, and now knight f2 check. The only move is rook f2, but after queen f2, yeah, black is definitely winning. It will be difficult now to stop the checkmate. Again, the bishop cannot move, the rook cannot move. White has to do something to stop the checkmate, but then black can just capture the pawn, the rooks are coming, or g4, f3. But fortunately for Paul Morphy, this guy, maybe he was not aware of the combination, which now I suppose everybody knows. King g1, and then this is this double check, and now Paul Morphy was very happy, I'm sure, to play the move queen g1, and then we have this checkmate with the knight, knight f2, checkmate. So this was a brilliant game of the 10 years old Paul Morphy, which is showing his potential, and now is maybe a sign of what could happen, and actually what happened later. Okay, so now let's see another game, and maybe I forgot to mention that the first game was played in 1849, when actually he was not like 10, but it was 12, he was 11 or 12, because he was born in 37. So how do we know this? Because the next game has a name. Some of the games which those players from this era has been played have some kind of name, and this game was played on Morphy's 12th birthday, and as well Paul Morphy has played this game at blindfold. This shows how good was he, because not only he's playing chess, but he plays blindfold against the adult guys. And this was played of his birthday. So let's see how the young Paul used to celebrate his birthdays. This time he is with white, so e4, e5, and now he is from the side of the white in the king's gambit. But now maybe he will show the other guys how to play exactly here. Black takes, and knight f3. And now again black is playing the move g5, which we have seen in the previous game. By the way, for those of you who are not familiar with the king's gambit, I just want to show you, especially of the guys who now starting their journey to the game and they're not experienced, and maybe they have seen this and they don't know what is this all about. f4, basically the idea of f4 is to fight for the central squares, but in a very risky way, because you sacrifice your f-pawn. For example, the difference from the queen's gambit, which is much more popular and much more safe, is that the queen's gambit you do it from the other side. You go d4, d5, and then c4. But when black takes the pawn to c4, this is not a problem for you. You can very easily take the pawn back. But now, first of all, with g5, black can defend the pawn very easy. So you lose the pawn in many occasions if black wants. And also this queen h4 check in many occasions is there, so sometimes you can also even lose the castle and lose the pawn. But actually black is not forced to take the pawn himself. He can play any random move, because if it's white to play, he is not threatening to take the pawn. Even you can play any random move, let's say the knight. If white takes, this is a huge mistake, because after queen h4 check, if you move the king, obviously you're going to be checkmated soon. After queen e4, bishop c5, and after g3, the problem for white is that this pawn is on e5. If she was still on f4, the move queen e2 would be saving the situation, because the queen will be pinned. But because this pawn is there, black can capture the rook, and he is winning a free rook. So basically what white wants to do on any random move almost is first to play knight f3, because you defend the knight, you put more pressure on the center, and more importantly you stop this check, and only then already he would consider to take on e5 if black is still not defending the pawn. So bishop c5 is a very popular move from black's point of view to stop the castle. And also even there is this move which for Morphy himself has played d5, a counter gambit, and after pawn takes e4, and then there are a lot of complications. Anyway, after pawn takes knight f3, g5 was played. Now we saw in the previous game, then the opponent of Paul Morphy went bishop c4, which is in general fine, but the young Paul in this blindfold game is playing one of the main moves and the best moves, which is h4 immediately. So why the move h4 now is good? And let's say if we have the previous situation now, let's say if it's like this, if you go h4 now, this would allow, if you remember, Morphy himself played here the move like h6. This move is possible in this situation because the bishop is protecting the rook, and if white is willing to trade everything, black will be actually very happy. So now he is keeping the extra pawn and he is more or less fine. But if you play h4 now, when the bishop is not yet on g7, h6 is a mistake, because after pawn takes, black here has a lot of problems. White took the pawn back, the king side is exposed, the king would be in danger, and also white has pressure on the h-file. So, of course, if you take, this is also not good from black's point of view, because now those two pawns will fall very, very easy, and white will have a nice center for nothing. g4 is the best move. And now white should move this knight. Normally he goes forward to e5 or to g5. It looks like both moves are the same, but they are not. Knight e5 is better move, which Morphy of course later has realized, but knight g5 was played in this era. There was such a kind of line where white was just sacrificing his knight, hoping for the best, basically. First of all, of course, black is not forced to attack the knight, but okay, he goes h6, which is the main line. And now, what is the choice? You don't have actually any choice but to take on f7. And basically now, white is a piece down, only after 6 moves, and it's difficult to say exactly what is the threat. But as I remember, I'm not completely sure, but the line was something like bishop c4. I think this used to be one of the main lines, hoping for king g7, and then after queen g4, indeed, I think the king will be checkmated. Maybe now queen f5 and then queen f7. So bishop c4 check, yes, and if you go to this side, you'll be checkmated. And I believe that d5 was the best move for black in order to open the diagonal for the bishop, and then already the king can go to g7 or e8, I don't know. I think usually they used to go to g7. If you go bishop e6, first of all bishop b7 might be coming, or I can just take and queen g4 check and queen f4. So anyway, white has compensation. But Morphy started with the move queen g4, which is maybe not a big difference comparing to bishop c4. And now the threat is bishop c4 check or queen f4 check. And if you go d5, there is no bishop c4, but white can just take this pawn. And then if you go like queen f6, for example, maybe he can try queen c7, and it is a very complicated position. So a lot of things might happen. But black, of course, is willing to defend the f4 pawn, so he goes queen f6, which seems okay so far, defending the pawn, and now the king is more or less safe. But after bishop c4 check, now the situation is very interesting, because this is not only check, but white is attacking the knight. So black can either move the king away, or he can push d5 himself. So d5 will be attacking the queen. And then there are again many possibilities for white. Okay, not so many. You have to take either the bishop, either the pawn. But if you take like this, then black could defend with the bishop. So it is one possible line. Or white can just take the bishop, and if black takes here, he can try to take the b7 pawn and then to take the rook as well. So plenty of possibilities, of course, which it is difficult to evaluate everything and to calculate, so you just have to try to find what is the best. Black, however, has moved the king to e7. To e8 is in general much better, because this would not close the bishop. And now this was some possible line. I think that yes, now white is taking the piece back, and then anything might happen. But he decided to move the king to e7. I'm not sure exactly what was his idea. Maybe that now when he pushed the d pawn, for example, if you take the bishop, this will be not check, but still it looks very good for white. But Morphy now sees another possibility. When the king is on e7 and the queen on f6, he is looking for the fork, so he moves the knight to c3 with the simple threat of knight d5. And now black should either move the king or the queen, or to try to defend with c6. Maybe queen g7 was deserving some attention, because also it stops bishop g8. But black is playing the pawn to c6 to stop the check. And now the next move is really very, very strong, and you could see such a move later in many games from this era, 19th century, or even later in the 20th, or even today. But you can see such a moves from very strong players. And because those strong players have studied the classic and they know how to attack the king in the center. But for a young boy in the 1849, when there were no chess books and no such examples, to find this move is in a blindfold game as well. It's really amazing. So he's now pushing the pawn to e5. What is the idea of this move? Of course, now we know that the idea to sacrifice this pawn is to open the e-file, so then you can attack the king. But it looks so risky, because you just give the pawn, not only you give your central pawn, but he can take with check. but Morphy have seen what is behind this. Of course, I believe that black again could have played queen to g7, but okay, he takes the pawn. King d1, because if king f2, queen d4 check, and you can lose the bishop. So now the idea is quite simple. It is rook e1, and then black will lose something. So now black is moving the king away, but I think he could have started with knight f6, and he should have started with this move. And unfortunately, there is no time for rook e1 because you have to move the queen. And when you move the queen, unless this is on h3, which looks a bit strange, but it's a possibility to stop the move d5, because otherwise it can go wrong for white. When you go queen f3, it is a bit tricky, but okay, d5 allows rook e1, and then bishop g4 is not working because you take the rook. So he can play d6, or he can play any moves, but black actually could be fine. But he first, after king d1, he also decided to move the king to d8 to move away from this rook e1. So rook e1 is still coming, and now black has to decide where to move his queen. He can go, to f6, to g7, he can try to protect the pawn on f4, which I think would make sense. Even queen d4 is some option. But he has played the move, which I think is a mistake, queen c5. I believe queen g7 is the most natural move to defend the knight. Obviously, white is not going to exchange the queens, but then you have to maybe take, this is the best which I can see, and say like knight f6, and then d5 is coming. Black have extra piece. It's hard to see some great threats for white, but okay, anything is possible. But after queen c5, white takes back the piece. So black finally goes d5. This is what he wanted to do from a long time. That's why he was happy to move the king, and of course, in general, this is a great idea. And now, can you try to see how Morphy have proceeded from here? His queen is under attack. He has to maybe defend the bishop. So he could go bishop e6 or queen g6, threatening check, but he finds the move rook e8 check. So he is attacking the bishop, which means that black has to take the rook. Now white takes the bishop, check. Black has only one move, king e7. So this is still far from clear, especially if you consider that it's a blindfold, because you can think, okay, queen b7, and then maybe knight d7 is coming, so you take the rook, I take the bishop, and here actually black is maybe better. Queen g1 was also possible, of course. The white king is much more exposed than the black one. So in general, I believe that when you see rook e8 check, you have to see the follow-up. Okay, you can still see queen e6 check, which is not that scary. But now knight d5 check is arriving. This is a very difficult move to see from a few moves earlier, and then black doesn't have a big choice. He should take, maybe he should take with the queen. Now he will be losing the queen for nothing, but he moves the king to d6. And again, queen d8 is possible. Queen f8 looks very good because you take the bishop and you take the queen. But Morphy managed to find queen c7, which is mate in 1, only for 17 moves. So this was a good present for his birthday. Win with this nice checkmate, with this combination, with sacrifice against Eugene Orossio. Okay, now let's see one more game, and we move to the next year, 1850, where he was 13 years or 12 and a half, depending on which month it was played. And I believe his opponent was his uncle, Ernest Morphy. And the game was actually not that quick like the ones which we have seen. And to me, actually, those are more interesting games to see in order to understand and to see how he was playing the whole game when he had to play until the end game or the late middle game. Because, okay, of course, it's good to look some miniatures when you sacrifice a piece and give mate in 10-15 moves. But if your opponent plays a little bit better, this is impossible to do in a normal game. So now let's see a game where his opponent was putting a better resistance. So Paul is playing with white, Paul Morphy against Ernest Morphy in 1850. And this time, already surprisingly, it's not King's Gambit, so Paul Morphy decided to try. So this time it's not Gambit and Knight f3, of course, is the best move in general. And now we have a more kind of normal positional game, even if, of course, there still could be some gambits. Bishop c4 is the beginning of the Italian game. Bishop c5, and then castles, which is, of course, possible move. So black is developing as well, normally. And now, today, the most popular move here is simply d3, which could lead to this Gioco Piano. Knight c3, of course, is a very popular move, especially amongst the guys who are like very young and starting to play now. All the juniors which I know play here Knight c3 castle, d3, d6, and those positions. Rook e1 is also possible, but Paul decided to play the move b4, which now is some kind of Evans gambit with a different move order. It is not easy to understand actually the insert of those moves, castle and knight f6. Is it in favor of white or black? Because normally this is before the castle knight f6, where you go b4. Black takes with the bishop, white goes c3. And now black has this advantage, maybe, that he has moved the knight on f6, so when he moves the bishop away, he needs to castle and the king will be safe. From the other hand, now, when white is castled, the lines for bishop a5 and then d4, now there is no spin. So this could be something maybe interesting for white. So this is an idea which I haven't seen, and yeah, now you look some random game from 1850 and you start to think about new ideas in the modern game. Ernest goes back to d6, which again, such an idea is not popular maybe until very recently, maybe, I don't know, 10-20 years ago. For the first time I have seen grandmasters to play similar move in the Evans, instead of bishop a5 and bishop e7, and the idea is to defend the pawn, which would allow black to castle very quickly, which makes sense now. d4, of course, white is following his plan, and black is defending this pawn very, very heavy on e5. So actually this setup is not so bad for black. You see all his pieces are close to each other and they're defending the e5 pawn. He's not intending to take on d4 because he knows that once the pawn on e5 leaves and white takes with the c pawn, and then e5 could be incoming. So for black it's better to keep the outpost and in general the position of the pawn on e5, because if you exchange the d pawn for the e pawn, then there is no other pawn to d4 to follow up. And if you push d5, black will be more or less happy because you close the diagonal. So what to do now? Paul is developing his pieces. This looks like a good move, bishop g5. And black also is developing. And now we have just one very good game where no one is making blunders. So both players are trying to improve. White now makes this useful move to support the e pawn. and black now has to try to develop his pieces. Okay, for black it's maybe a bit more complicated, even if he is with extra pawn, but somehow for white the game is more easy. You just move the knight to d2, the queen c2 maybe or somewhere, then the rook to d1, and you have maybe the next few moves coming more easy. As for black now, he has to find what to do with the light square bishop, with the central pawns, and since the d pawn is closing now the light square bishop and the bishop is here the other one, so there is no d6, it looks like this bishop has to go to b7. So either you play b6, which makes sense, or you maybe want to make some kind of expanded fianchetto with a6, b5. He goes a6, which if it's with an idea b5, it would be looking okay. Now Paul is developing his queen, black now is chasing the other bishop, and now of course we know today that you should simply go back to h4 in such a positions, and if g5, first of all you can just go back, or you can consider such a sacrifices, and then this pin is really very annoying. Maybe black can survive, but maybe not. He has to be very careful. But it's not a good idea to take on f6, because now the pressure is off for black and he can breathe easier, and there is basically no pressure towards his pieces. Paul is developing with the knight. Again, he is now sacrificing this pawn, which it is not very clear what is going on. For example, if black takes now, e5 is not possible, I believe, that because after knight takes, I don't see exactly what white can do. Knight e4, there is knight f3 check. And if you take, for example, black takes, let's say knight takes, queen takes, white have sacrificed one more pawn, maybe knight f3 is the point, hoping for queen f6, e5, but after queen to somewhere, you have e5. Yes, this is interesting, of course. Maybe you have queen g6. Unfortunately, you don't have any threats, otherwise it looks very beautiful. But it is, yeah, it's a pawn sacrifice, and this time Uncle Ernest decided not to take this pawn. He could play basically, yeah, anything which makes sense, like b5, but b5 now would allow this pin, and then already there is some pressure in the center and as well on the diagonal. Rook e8, of course, is possible, and he decided to play an active move, g5, which looks on paper very nice for black, because he wants to push g4, and this will actually trap the knight. It will force white to take on e5, and then you take with the knight, you take with the queen, and you attack towards h2. So now, what do you do as white? You can of course block the pawn with h3 if you want, but then maybe he can go h5, and again g4 is coming. You can move this knight to make space, but then again he can take on d4. So he takes on e5, and now I think again today maybe most people would take with the bishop. We kind of now tend to give more importance to the bishops, but he takes with the bishop. And if you remember, Paul himself in the previous game, he took with the bishop on d4 instead of knight, so maybe the knights were considered at that time to be more dangerous pieces, because they can jump and do a lot of stuff, of course. And it makes some sense, because after knight e5, knight e5, then already this knight on e5 would be very strong. So black wants to take this pawn. Paul is defending with the rook. g4 is incoming, so Uncle Ernest is playing very aggressively, and now he is taking the initiative. White takes the bishop, and black has now extra pawn and a good knight, and the queen is controlling everything, so there is no attack. So let's see how Paul managed to deal with this game when he is under some pressure and without the pawn. Now I think black should just play like d6, move the bishop out, move the rook, and then black of course is much better. He goes h5, which is not a mistake, but before I start the attack with black, I probably would consider to move the bishop and the rook out. Now white actually has a lot of problems how to improve his pieces. The queen can hardly move, the knight, okay, you can try to exchange this knight or to go to f1. The bishop cannot do much, so Paul is looking what he can do. And after h5, probably he sees some kind of threat from h4, followed by h3, and after g3, like knight f3 check, and knight takes queen f3, and then checkmate. So he's moving the rook here to defend those squares, which is a good defensive move, I would say. Black is again pushing the h-pawn, and now white is moving the rook to f1, which already is showing that Morphy is not thinking only about the defense, but this move is preparing a move like f3 or f4, and then already he can start to think about the attack. And here we see that actually the last few moves from black's point of view, even if they look very active and maybe dangerous, they could be like waste of time. For those two moves, he could have moved d6, bishop e6, trade the bishop, bring the other rook, or move the king, or to do something. Because now he moves the king, which again I'm not sure exactly what is the idea. Is it rook h8 maybe, and then somehow g3 to open the file, queen h4, but now Paul is playing the move f4. Now this move looks like a very strong move again, because if black captures, now first of all white can capture with a knight or with a pawn. Probably with the knight is better, of course, because then you have the f-file, the rook can swing here to make a rook lift, then the bishop already is attacking the pawn, the queen can go, and then the black king is exposed. So black doesn't want to open files, so he could consider to move the knight back, but instead he founds a move which is pinning the rook, queen b6, which looks very annoying, and it could be actually easily missed from white. If you take the knight after queen e3, yeah, black should be better. But the problem is, how do you defend this rook? The queen cannot do anything, the knight c4, knight takes c4, so the only option is rook to e1. Now already black has to move his knight, so he goes to g6, which is okay to attack the pawn, and it doesn't make sense to push the pawn, because then black will return to this very nice square and it will be impossible to remove him from there. So Paul realizes this, that the pawn has to control the e5 square, and he is defending with g3, which is allowing black to open the h-file. And now actually the move king g7 makes a lot of sense, because the rook is arriving to the h-file. So the situation is developing nicely for black, maybe. However, he still needs some time to open the diagonal for the bishop, and then to bring the other rook to help for the attack. And white now already has developed all his pieces. He needs to get rid of this pin, and once he does this, then already he can start to think about some moves with the pawn. So that's why he's now chasing the queen away, or at least he's trying to chase her away from the diagonal. Ernest is going to c5, which is the best move. And now Paul goes e5, which this move is very risky, of course. But okay, now let's see what will happen. why this move is risky. It opens this long diagonal, which in the moment seems that it is not a problem, because if you move the queen, I can just go queen g2 in the worst case, and to trade the queens, and then more or less it is fine. But now black goes b5, attacking the knight. So the game becomes very complicated. What do you do with this knight? He goes back to d2. Knight a5 was interesting, although very difficult move to assess, because he can go queen b6 and then there are some big complications, which is very difficult to be seen. Knight d2 is more natural, intending to go to e4. Now, first of all, I'm not sure exactly what was wrong with bishop b7, because knight e4, yeah, you can go there, but then all those pieces are pinned, so it looks very... I think something similar happened in the game. You will play queen b6. Instead, black has played the move rook h3, which turned out to be a mistake. I think after bishop b7, probably something like this, and then yeah, this looks very dangerous for white. Maybe queen f2 you can defend, but pawn down and black has the h-file, he has the diagonal, it will be difficult. Why rook h3 was a mistake? It looks like a very strong move because black wants to take on g3, since this rook is pinned, and he needs some time to play bishop b7 to bring the other rook to h8, and then he will just deliver checkmate. But after knight e4 and queen to b6 now, yeah, queen c6 was maybe, according to the engine, better move. Now, surprisingly, Paul goes into a counterattack. He doesn't have so many options, by the way. He cannot move the knight after queen b6 because again rook g3 check, and this rook is pinned. The rook is pinned anyway, so you cannot move it. The other rook has to defend. So black is looking again to bishop b7, and then, yeah, like I told you, rook h8 and to win the game, and not much that you can do. But he goes bishop takes f7. This looks a little bit like a desperate move, and now black has so many options, but it is a very interesting attempt to complicate the game, because you take one pawn, now the knight is somehow hanging. Of course, the idea is that if you take the knight g5 check, and you move the king, and now I could take the rook, maybe I can go with the queen somewhere, probably just take, and then f5, and then f6, and then already this is looking really good for, or maybe queen e4 first, or queen f5. This is looking okay. It's still not clear, but this will be an improvement. And black could take knight f4, he could go knight h4, he could play bishop b7, he decided to go to b7. Just to follow up with his plan to bring the rook, he is not so bothered about this pawn. Now white goes knight f2, which looks like a critical moment in the game, defending the checkmate on h1 and attacking the rook, and also even attacking the pawn. But of course now, again, black could simply take here, but then it would be queen f5 check. So this is very tricky. Queen d7 check is coming, or you can take on h3 and then push the pawns. And now Ernest goes for knight takes f4. And the game is now really very wild. But of course I'm more worried about the white pieces, because his king is more exposed. The black king, for the moment, seems to me okay. If you take, I suppose, rook e3, right? Rook e3, and then, yeah, white has problems. So what to do? white goes queen to f5, defending the bishop and keeping an eye on the knight and on the pawn. And now again, black has so many options, it is difficult to understand what is the best. But he plays the move now rook to f8, which definitely looks not very good to me. Rook f8, this cannot be the best move. Okay, it is attacking the bishop, yeah. And in case of queen to g4, I suppose you just take here. And then if I take the rook, it's still not clear, by the way, what is going on and who is winning. But I think actually white should be winning here already. Probably after rook f8. I mean, here the best move seems to me that it is queen h6. Because now there is a threat made in one move. And then, yeah, queen f6 is the way to stop it. But then this endgame, I just take queen f6, I take the bishop. So black should be much better, definitely. Instead, rook f8. And now white actually has a lot of moves. And Morphy has found the best move, which is not very easy, to push the pawn to e6. So now, what can black do? We are defending the bishop, so rook f7 is not possible. This is not possible. Rook g3 is not possible. The knight is hanging. But if you take with the knight, there is queen g6. So he has to take with the pawn. Now queen g4 check. And I think now, yeah, black is just losing. The point is that if you take here, and I take, for example, here, now there is rook e6 check. This is why the move e6 was the best, because you cannot hide to the e file. And that's why he goes to the h file, and now after queen f4, also knight h3 was good. Now black has problems. Queen g6 is still threatening mate in 1, in case Paul didn't see. If you take the rook, queen g2 is a mate. If you don't give a check, again queen g2 is a mate, rook h1 is a mate, so you have to give only checks basically, or to cover this diagonal, which you can easily do. But queen f6 was played, king h7, the only move, and now knight to e4, with the threat knight g5 checkmate, which is unable to be prevented. Of course, you can sacrifice the queen, but this is not a solution. You can try rook g3, hoping for this checkmate, but of course, when white takes with the rook, this would be game over. So there is not much to do. Black took rook f7, and then after knight g5, both kings are in danger, but it is important who is starting first with the checks. And this is Paul, and now he delivered this checkmate. So it was really very, very interesting game with his uncle, in which he showed a lot of resilience, how to survive in a difficult circumstances, and to launch a counterattack and to win the game. So those are the earliest games of Paul when he was young. Next time we're going to proceed to understand what happened next.